All righty. Thank you Eva, for letting everyone in and starting the recording. All right, we're just going to go ahead and jump into it since we got a jam-packed presentation for y'all tonight. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Monday evening as we hear from Russ Cohen about nibbling on natives. Before I introduce Russ, a few ELA housekeeping items. We want to extend a warm invitation to an ELA Mid-Atlantic meetup hosted by Harmony Hill Nursery in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. You can register at ecolandscaping.org. Additionally, please feel free to email any ELA personnel with any inquiries. Lastly, please complete the survey link in the chat at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, allow me to introduce Russ Cohen. Russ Cohen is a naturalist and wild foods enthusiast based in Massachusetts with a deep love for nature ignited in his youth. Russ turned a high school class into a lifelong passion for edible wild plants. This passion blossomed into expertise, not just with plants, but also with mushrooms he encountered on a trip to the Soviet Union. Russ's dedication to the environment extends beyond foraging. He holds a land use planning degree and both a master's in natural resources and a law degree from the Ohio State University. For many years, Russ served as the rivers advocate for the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game. In retirement, Russ can be found giving leading walks about wild edibles or writing articles about his favorite native plants in the Northeast. Russ's foraging book, Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten, published by the Essex County Greenbelt Association, came out in June of 2004 and now is in its 8th printing. He's become a modern-day Johnny Appleseed, cultivating a nursery overflowing with over 1,000 native edible species. Russ is then collaborating with land trusts, state and federal agencies, schools and colleagues, tribal groups, organic farms, and others to plant plants from his nursery in appropriate places on their properties. Russ, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Catherine, and hi, everybody. I've just come in from several wonderful hours of cross-country skiing because here in New England, 2 hours north of here, it snowed over 18 inches just a couple days ago. So I had to go up there and enjoy that wonderful late season opportunity. So I'm going to see if I can get my slides to show here. Okay, the show is officially beginning. So as many of you in the audience know, an increasing number of land conservation and other environmental groups are starting their presentations with land acknowledgements, which is really important, especially if you're a land trust and you're preserving land that was originally the territory of indigenous people. And I like to bring that up, but for me, this subject is even more important because it is the content of my presentation is information that I owe a great debt of gratitude to indigenous people for figuring out, because they're the people that inhabited this area for thousands of years, and they're the ones that figured out which native plants are edible. So that information has trickled down to me, but I want to acknowledge the fact that it's their information. I'm extremely grateful that they figured this stuff out so that people like me can give it back to indigenous people where colonization severed the connection between them and the plants, and just share the news with everybody. And if I were to direct your attention to a particular wonderful source of information on this topic, it's this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I hope everybody in the audience has read. If you haven't, I urge you to read it. It is a transforming book. And in this book in particular, if you just have time to read one chapter, I would say read the chapter called The Audible Harvest, which is all about foraging. And in here, Robin Wall Kimmerer produces this list of principles, which I liken to the 10 Commandments of foraging. And she suggests that people might even want to put it on a laminated card and take it with them out in the woods when they're trying to figure out when is it appropriate to pick something or not pick something, and to follow the protocol that she's just here, which I think would be a great idea. All right, and I will talk more about indigenous stuff as I'm going through my presentation. Let's talk about Doug Tallamy. I assume that everybody in the audience has heard of him. And so this is all text-heavy slides. You're going to get a chance to see this recording and this information later on, so don't worry about reading everything that I say here. But anyway, his astute observation is that we need native plants because they support the caterpillars that the birds eat, that supports the food web. And so he, more than anybody else, I think, is trying to lead the movement to get people to plant native plants in their yard. And so lots of people that have heard this message are getting into it. You know, state agencies are putting out publications, nonprofits are putting out publications to tell people what are native plants and where to find them, where to purchase them, and stuff like that. All right, so now I'm going to point out the Aspetuck Land Trust, a land trust that hired a full-time person, Marianne LeMay, who just, her job is to meet with homeowners and get them to plant native plants in their yard. So this land trust, which land trust major purpose is to preserve conservation land, but this land trust very astutely observed that they can't get the job done if all they do is preserve conservation land. They need to get people to do it, because as much land as they might possibly own, it's still going to be a very, very small proportion of all the land in their service area. So they got to get homeowners to get on the program too. And here's another good program in Connecticut, the Ecotype Project, where they're trying to promote planting native plants to the folks there, which I think is a great idea. Okay, so this slide is from an Ecological Landscape Association program I went to in person about 12 years ago that was given by a wonderful person named Kate Venturini from Rhode Island. And her job at the time was to meet with homeowners along the shore of Narragansett Bay and to get them to plant native plants on their properties to help absorb pollutants coming off from roads and parking lots and lawns and stuff like that, to help absorb the excess nutrients, things like that, to help keep the waters of the bay clean. Really important objective. And so she had this chart in her talk, and I'm sure just about everybody in the audience has seen charts like this, where you have the names of the plants on the left and then have the various attributes on the right, these different columns, like grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade, and so on. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't tell people that. And I said, why not? And she said, we don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You've got blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. Well, I said, we might as well tell them what else is edible then. So now in Rhode Island, they have an edibility column and the native plants information that they share on the Rhode Island website. And here is the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too, I think provides an additional powerful incentive for people to plant them that might be insufficiently induced to do so just on the pure ecological rationale. And so pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for just a second. In my mind, I can imagine a suburban couple, husband and wife, living on a good-sized lot, suburb somewhere, and the wife has heard Doug Tallamy talk, or she's read Doug Tallamy's book, and she says to the husband, it's really important for us to put native plants in, we have to do it. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. And that's when she can bring him to one of my talks and learn about this angle, this what's in it for me angle, which is just a basic human, driver of human behavior. And let's just recognize it. And what I say to people like Doug Tallamy is, does it really matter why somebody puts a native plant in their yard as long as they do it? And if they do it because they want a share of the berries that the plant is producing along with the birds, it's still putting a plant in. And so even from types like him, I get a grudging exceptions. Yeah, we should talk about the fact that many of our native plants are edible by people, and that will encourage them to plant them in their yard. I realize it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in natives, but I think it's a good chance of winning an additional group of people that aren't convinced just on the fact that it helps the critters to do it. All right, so first natural question is, what plants are native? Well, in New England, and I apologize for those of you that aren't in this region, that I'm not citing the specific sources that you have, but here in New England, we have our Native Plant Trust, and they have put on a website, part of their website, called Go Botany, which is a wonderful resource. They have a page like this that you're seeing for every vascular plant in New England, and it tells you the species range. So if you look at this map in New England right here, these black lines are county boundaries, and if a county is colored in green, that means that species is deemed to be native to that county. All right, so for people that care, I want to plant native not only to my region, but also to my county. I want plants to be native to that. This is a really great resource to use. And then the issue of local ecotype comes in, and this is really important for some people, where they say not only does it have to be a native plant, but it has to be from locally obtained seed and grown locally in order to have the plant be good. Otherwise, it's not good. And I've had other botanists and ecologists disagree vehemently with this. So it's kind of a raging debate amongst the ecologist botanist world about how important ecotypes is. But what I can say in favor of the local ecotype argument, that if you are able to find a plant that was raised from seed that was gathered locally and was grown locally, the chance of that plant succeeding in your yard or wherever you're planting it, I think is greater than a plant that's been shipped in from Minnesota or Mississippi or something like that. So you can absolutely state that. Okay, and for folks that are just starting out that want to know, well, where do I find some seed? There are some folks out there producing wonderful seed, and this is the Wild Seed Project, which is up in Maine, and they're carrying a bunch of native edible species, so that's one place you can get the seed. And also, for those of you that would like to try to do this at home and raise your own edible native plants, or actually any native plants, this website is an excellent source of information to help just regular homeowners, just regular people with no particular skills or training at all in plant propagation to do it themselves with native seed at home. Okay, so if the next question you might be asking is, okay, I'm convinced I should plant some native edible plants, but what's going to work in my yard? And then you go back to the Native Plant Trust and you go to this section of it called their Native Plant Finder, their Garden Plant Finder, where they have all these boxes and you just check whatever conditions that you're confronted with in your yard, and then the computer program will spit out the plant species that meet your criteria. So, so if you got a dry yard, you got a wet yard, you want tall plants, you want short plants, whatever it is that your criteria are, you can just put them into the database and then it will spit out what meets your criteria. So I checked the edible box just out of curiosity to see what would show up there. And so I got 80 species showing up as edible in the database. So that's pretty good. There's actually over 190 species that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative sample. So then I clicked on sweet fern to see what would pop up there. And here's the page for sweet fern that goes into more details about the kind of habitat it likes to grow in. So that's a really good resource for those of you that want more guidance about what might work on your yard, your property, wherever you're working. Okay, so with that, I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about specific edible native species, and then at the end of the show, I'll tell you about my job to plant them out in the landscape. Okay, so let's start with this guy. So this is the ostrich fern. This is the quote-unquote fiddlehead fern, the kind you see for sale in the fancy restaurants and the produce stores. And as far as I know, nobody is farming these ostrich ferns. So if you ever see one showing up in a produce bin or on our menu, it was gathered from the wild. And that's not inherently harmful. You know, I gather stuff from the wild all the time. It's just the scale and the way that the commercial pickers are doing it. So to go back to the advice that's in the Honorable Harvest, she encourages, Robin, the author, encourages folks to approach native species with some forbearance and restraint, which is really good idea, even ecologically, even if you're not doing it from a Native American perspective. You're just doing it because it's a good idea for sustainability. The ostrich fern is a great example. You see, here's a typical clump of ostrich ferns growing in this vase-shaped clump. Now, I encourage people to limit their harvesting to 1 or maybe 2 of the cold up parts per clump. That's it. Let the rest grow out. It's a totally sustainable level of harvesting. The plant can definitely take that level of picking, and there's no problem at all. Unfortunately, what some people do, and I have a suspicion this is mostly the people that are picking to sell the plants, is they'll pick every single fithead they see in the patch. And you can really sap a lot of strength from the rhizome that way. You can actually kill the plant by harvesting it that hard. So just 1 or 2 per clump, that's a sustainable level of harvest. So, and to go back to indigenous knowledge for just a second, so sometimes there's wonderful practical details about plants embedded in indigenous knowledge. And I learned this particular case for the ostrich fern from Nancy Turner, who is an ethnobotanist actually from the Pacific Northwest, but I learned from her that the word that the Maliseet tribe uses, and their tribal territory straddles what we now call the Maine and New Brunswick line, is their word masos to describe the curled part of an ostrich fern. It's the same exact word they use to describe the circling motion a dog makes before it lies down. And when I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, I see the similarity. Yeah, it's amazing. But so that's what you get when you're, living in a place and just, paying close attention to patterns in nature over many, many thousands of years. You get to see patterns like that and see similarities. So it's great when indigenous language can reveal that evidence of strong observational skills. Okay, so in the wild where you're going to run into ostrich ferns is this alluvial floodplain soil. That's typically where you're going to see them. So this is a patch along the Connecticut River in Massachusetts. But this is a plant that will grow other places, as I'll explain in just a second. And here's another way to distinguish the ostrich fern from other species of ferns. These guys right here, these are the fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds that never get more than a foot tall. And if you cut their stems in cross section, they form a U shape like a celery stalk, just like the fiddleheads do. All right, so if you've ever brought the fiddleheads to the store and cooked them up and been not particularly impressed with them, you might want to try this cooking method, which is amply demonstrated to me by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River in the town of Northfield, Mass. And she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after she picked them, and they were truly exquisite that way. So that was the secret. Okay, and here's an example of a suburban yard not far from where I live outside of Boston, where the homeowners just planted ostrich ferns because they are a nice addition to the landscape. So I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty confident this homeowner has no clue that this is the edible fiddlehead fern, that they just planted these plants because they look nice in the yard. And by the way, so this isn't alluvial floodplain soil. It's just growing in some other soil and seems to be happy. And these ferns will spread vegetatively. So if you put a couple in and they're happy, your patch will gradually grow, which I hope you'll be happy with. Okay, so marsh marigold. Now, this is a very cherished spring wildflower around here. And it's really fun. Around this time of year, not long from now, will you be able to go into the woods and see these beautiful blooming yellow wildflowers along perennial streams before the trees leaf out. And it's a gorgeous sight to see. So you might say, how can you pick that plant to eat it? Well, I don't harvest a lot of this plant, but I like to keep it in my show because it is a species that was eaten a lot by country people, especially in times before the Second World War, when people didn't have refrigerators and green plants weren't being shipped in from thousands of miles away that you go to the supermarket to get. And so people were living off plants put up in their root cellars or in preserve jars and stuff like that. And so when spring came, they were really eager to start eating leafy green vegetables. And so some of our spring perennial plants, like ostrich ferns and marsh marigolds, would provide that early season green vegetable opportunity when the plants really hadn't started growing in their vegetable gardens yet. So the key thing about eating this one is you have to harvest the leaves before the flowers come out, and you have to boil them in at least one change of water to make them safe to eat. And then after you do that, it looks like spinach. You might say to yourself, I'll just go to the store and buy spinach, which is perfectly fine, but it is fun to gather your own marsh marigold leaves. So what I say, because we don't want to harm this plant at all, 1 or 2 leaves per plant. That's it. Let the rest of the leaves attach to the plant, a sustainable level of harvest. And I have seen places in New England where there are thousands of these plants growing. And if you're seeing a big patch like that, 1 or 2 leaves per plant, you can still gather quite a lot to, have a nice side dish for your supper. And this is a fun plant to grow from seed. So about 6 weeks after it blooms, you'll see these structures right here, and the little seeds are inside these little capsules here, and they split open, and then the seeds fall out into the muck, and that's how new marsh marigolds start to grow. So you can gather those seeds and sow plants with them, which I've done in my nursery. And so this is a plant that I'm growing that I'm now planting out in sites where the marsh marigold isn't growing, but where I'm getting a good sense is habitat where they would like to grow. Okay, so this species is common in the eastern half of the U.S., especially, from like the southern Appalachians further north into southern Canada. It's a species that indigenous people ate a lot of. In fact, the city names for Chicago and Winooski, Vermont are both derived from their respective indigenous tribal names for, translated to English means place where a lot of this plant grows. All right, and the name the colonists used for this plant when they came over is wild leek. And the plant got to be known by them, and there was a fair amount of collecting going on as people would be out like trout fishing in the spring, turkey hunting, as they gathered some of these plants and eat them too, which is fine. But about 20 years ago, this species began to experience a meteoric rise in popularity because all the chefs and foodies started hyperventilating about it. And they weren't calling it the traditional New England name, wild leek. They started calling it by the Southern Appalachian name, which is how it's known in the food trade, and that is ramps. And so people are just going gaga over this plant, and they still are. And unfortunately, what that has engendered is this bit of a gold rush mentality where people go into the woods and see a patch of wild leeks like this, and they'll dig up every single plant, and they'll wipe out this entire patch. So that's obviously not a sustainable way of interacting with this species. So here's another example of what the plants look like. And you can look at other plants that share the same preference of habitat, like the Dutchman's breeches right here. So this is what's called a rich woods species. So it likes to grow where some of our special cherished wildflowers, like the trilliums of bloodroots, also like to grow. And when you dig up these plants, not only is that not good for this plant itself, but if you're leaving any bare soil behind, you're creating the ideal growing medium for the garlic mustard and the other invasives to sneak in and really disrupt these pristine rich woods habitats where the wild leeks like to grow. So here's the close-up of what the plants look like. And you see that each plant has 2 or 3 of these large fleshy leaves that go down to a little bulb like a scallion. Here's the good news. The leaves are delicious. You do not have to dig up these plants at all to enjoy that wonderful flavor. In fact, the advice I've been trying to get to people gathering these plants in the wild is please consider shifting some, most, or ideally all of your harvesting to leaves only, and ideally just 1 leaf per plant. Leave the remaining leaf attached to the bulb, leave the bulb in the ground, and that it's a totally sustainable way of interacting with this plant. So, and I am going to skip through the next couple slides, which go into some personal efforts I've had to try and get the word out about this more sustainable harvesting level. I'm just going to skip that and go to a way that you can get this plant established in your yard in an ethical way. So pardon me while I skip that. All right, so how do you get these plants? Well, you can go to a place like Garden in the Woods, which is outside of Boston, Framingham, Massachusetts, but I suspect that those of you that aren't from this area will be able to find native plant nurseries that are doing the same thing. So what Garden in the Woods is doing is they've set up these stock beds that they cram full of the wild leeks, and then they're able to extract a small percentage of what's in there, and then they pot these plants up, and then they sell them with the other native plants at their plant shop, at their nursery. And people will buy these plants and take them home to establish their own wild leek patches in their own yard, which is great. But I say for the folks that do that, I bet they're not digging the plants up, because that would be like killing the goose that laid the golden egg. No, you leave the plants in the ground, you enjoy the leaves, and that way you continue to have the plant growing on your property, which is ideally what you want to do. Okay, so here's a wonderful spring ephemeral plant called Spring Beauty. And I've got this growing on my own property, and the whole plant is edible. So those flowers, the leaves are edible. The little tubers look like little miniature, and I say miniature because they're very small. They're only about a ½ an inch in diameter usually. And they're called fairy spuds, but you can cook them and eat them like potatoes. And something that you'd only want to do if the plant is very abundant. But, you know, as I say, I've got this growing on my own backyard, so I can harvest them there if I wanted to, and just leave enough of the tubers behind so the plant can continue to thrive in that location, which is what you need to do with native species. But really, if you're thinking, well, what could be a nice, pretty ground cover that I could grow in a place that has a neutral pH soil? So this is not an acidic soil plant. This is for a neutral pH, kind of like the same soil that the wild leeks like. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead to milkweed. And if you haven't figured it already, my plants are organized in my show by foraging opportunity, which is how I think, because I was a forager for 50 years before I became a plant propagator. So that's just how my plant thinks by foraging opportunity. So this is the common milkweed, the only one that's edible by people, and I call it a procrastinating forager's dream food because there's at least 4 edible stages to the plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage shows up. So this is actually edible stage number 3, when the flower buds are produced on the plant, and when they're in a nice tight green cluster like that, they're edible. Now, I do have a recommended cooking method for any part of the milkweed that you want to eat, and that is whatever part of the plant you're picking, boil it for 7 minutes. And that's definitely enough cooking, and you will disperse any possible toxicity that the plant has by all that boiling. Pour the water off, don't use it for soup stock or anything. And then what you have left, you can eat. So if you look at this bowl of these milkweed milkweed buds in this bowl have been boiled for 7 minutes. And look how well they hold up. If anything, they look even nicer than they did when they were attached to the plant. So you could eat these as a side dish just like this, or you can incorporate them into different dishes. So in my foraging book, I've got this dish called milkweed egg puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole. And the boiled milkweed flower buds work really well in that recipe. And even the pods, when the pods are up to 1.5 inches long, you can boil them for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is really similar to green beans. All right, but here is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us how ecologically important common milkweed, as well as all the other members of the Asclepias genus, are for the monarch butterflies. Now, this is the only one that people can eat, so we can't eat butterfly weed, we can't eat swamp milkweed. But so I certainly wouldn't want to do anything that would deplete the number of milkweeds that are out there in the environment. So if this is a concern of yours, one easy way to avoid harming the butterflies is to just eat the young pods, because the young pods don't play any significant role in the butterfly's life cycle. The caterpillars aren't eating the pods, and so you can eat those. And usually when you're gathering them from the plant, you're only gathering the minority on the plant, because there'll be other ones that will be too small to gather and ones that are too ripe to gather. And so you're just picking the ones that are the right degree of ripeness. So you're automatically from that letting some ones mature and go to seed and producing more plants. So this is a plant I'm actively propagating in my nursery, planting out on my sites, but I'm also planting it at my house. And I'm going to show you how I'm doing that. So that's my house where I'm talking to you right now. I have a different car now, but I still have this boat. And here's our driveway. And we deliberately planted blueberry bushes along our driveway, and the common milkweed showed up there. And we said, great, yeah, please grow here. And hopefully the butterflies will find you. So they have. And we know that because we saw them. And this net, by the way, is just so that we get some blueberries. If we did not net our blueberries, the birds would get every single one. So this way, we share, the birds get some, we get some. Okay, but the butterflies are attracted to the milkweed that's growing with the blueberries. And we know that the females have found them because one day we went out, and this chrysalis was attached to a hinge on our garage door just a few feet away. And fortunately, it was attached to a hinge because when the garage door went up and down, the chrysalis just went for a ride up and down as the door opened and closed. And it did that for 2 weeks. And then one morning we went out, and the chrysalis was clear because the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. So that's a great proof of how you can walk the walk and encourage native plants to grow in your own yard as a way of balancing out what you're harvesting from the wild. All right, here's a wonderful native species called basswood, this Tilia americana. And you may also be familiar with its cousin, Tilia cordata, the little leaf linden, which is actually an introduced tree from Europe. It's used a lot as a street tree because it's very resistant to air pollution. And by the way, they're edible the exact same way, where they have the native one or the introduced one. And the two edible parts are the young leaves in the spring. When they first come out, they're very tender and very mild. You can pop them straight into your mouth. You can put them into salads. You can do what they do in England with these leaves. In England, they call these lime trees. And they'll make lime sandwiches, which are like the watercress sandwiches on the white bread with the crust cut off. And they'll just layer the young linden leaves as the filling for the sandwich. So so you can do that with these leaves. So that's the first edible stage. And then the second edible stage in the Boston area, this is around the second or third week of June when the plants begin to bloom. They give off this wonderful lemon honey type smell. And you make a tea from the flowers, and it has that wonderful flavor. And by the way, this thing right here is called a samara, and that is attached to the stem that the flowers are on. And when you pull the flowers off the plant, that comes with it. And you don't have to pick those off. That can go into your tea mug, wherever you're preparing your tea to. Does not deter from the flavor at all. So you brew the beverage, and it has a wonderful flavor, and it has two medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So herbalists really love to recommend linden tea to their clients. Okay, so let's talk about phenology for just a second. So some of you may recognize this plant and know that it's called shadbush. Now, why would a tree be named after a fish? Because fish is the anadromous shad that runs in the river, because it so happens that when these plants are blooming, it corresponds roughly with the time that the shad are running in the rivers. And indigenous people figure this out. And so as they were, being where they are, and they saw the shad trees blooming, they said, okay, we need to pull up stakes and go to the rivers and start catching these fish as they're swimming upstream. And so sometimes native plants can give you a phenological clue to something else you should be doing, but also these flowers are in and of themselves worth paying attention to because they're revealing the location of the plant. Because a lot of cases with edible wild plants, at the time when the plants are most visible and most easily discernible in the landscape, does not correspond with the time when the edible part is out. So these plants bloom about a week and a half before the crab apples and apple trees bloom, so they really stand out. And when they bloom, when the fruit is ripe, is in June, and from Massachusetts southward. So like in Pennsylvania, a lot of people call this plant Juneberry for that reason. In northern New England, they really should call it Julyberry because that's when the fruit is ripe. And you see when the fruit is ripe, it's this purpley color, which is a hard color to see at a distance. So it's better that you already know where the Juneberry plant is growing. And here's a close-up of the fruit. So this purple one is the fully ripe fruit. This red one is a day or two short of being fully ripe. And this ripe fruit, when you taste it, they look like a lot like blueberries. They got the crowns on them like blueberries do, but they really don't taste like blueberries. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds, which is not surprising when you find out that Juneberries and cherries and almonds are all related plants in the rose family. So, it's a wonderful flavor. It's really fun to stuff your face right by the tree. And now songbirds like these fruits too, and you could say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be picking any fruits because the songbirds need them. Well, the typical Juneberry tree is 12 feet tall, and the songbirds can fly up in the upper branches and eat those fruits, and you can pick some from the lower branches, and usually there's plenty of fruit to go around, and you can share. You can share and each have some. All right, so if you're in the Boston area, this information should be valuable to you. Those of you that are calling in from further away, I apologize for that. But I used to work in downtown Boston, and just a short walk from my office was a park where our state parks agency had planted dozens of the shadbush bushes. And in late June, early July, I could walk there in my lunch hour and pick at least a quart of fruit without that much effort. Just delicious fruit, stuff your face right from the tree if you want, really yummy. But I had an ulterior motive in doing this. I wanted to grow my own Juneberry trees, so the seeds in these fruits. Now the seeds are edible, so it's perfectly fine to just chew them right up. But I had enough discipline with some of the fruits to spit the seeds into my hand and then store the seeds in a little plastic bag and stick them in my fridge. So I'll tell you that story in just a second. I just want to point out that Juneberry makes excellent strudel, especially when you mix it with mulberries. Okay, so I would save those seeds, put them in a little plastic bag, and put them in my stratification fridge. And for those of you that don't know, stratification is just a fancy word for winter, otherwise known as this extended cool period. Most of our native seeds have evolved with little timers in them to understand that they need to be cold for a prolonged period before it's safe to sprout and germinate. And they're basically evolved to account for winter. Because if seeds didn't have that and they sprouted in November and then the nasty weather came and the little seedlings would die. So this way they just bide their time until the spring comes and then they start growing. Well, sometimes when you store a native seed in your fridge, it gets precocious and the little timers go off and they start sprouting, which is what's happening here. And when that happens, you have to sow them right away. So this happened in the winter time, so I had to sow them indoors and put them in a little windowsill planting box at my house. And then they got bigger. And so these plants are now 4 feet tall, and I'm actually planting them out on the landscape. So they're big enough now to be planted. And these are plants I grew from seed that I gathered in a public park, just the way I described. Okay, wild strawberry is a great plant growing from seed. It also propagates by stolons, so it will spread in your yard once you get a few plants established. And just about everybody is a place to put wild strawberry in. If you've got any mowed area, any mossy area, wild strawberries do fine. They like sun, but they'll tolerate some shade. And lots of wild pollinators visit these flowers. These fruits are small, but they're delectable. And you can make tea from the leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. And so it's definitely a plant worth adding to your yard. And if you plant it in your lawn, the plants will not mind getting mowed or stepped on. They'll just step right in with your regular regime of managing your lawn. So for those of you that still have lawns, and I'm one of those people, it's a great way to diversify your lawn beyond just grass. And I'll give you another example of that in just a second. So when I have extra seed, I like to share it. And so here's an example of a girls' school, Miss Hall School, which is out in Western Mass in Pittsfield, where they have a greenhouse on campus. And the girls are already raising little vegetable starts and selling them at a spring plant sale so that homeowners could come and buy their broccoli plants, their tomato plants, and stuff like that. So I brought them some wild strawberries, and you can see they've just repurposed these clamshells that we used to buying berries in anyway, put the growing medium in there, sprinkled the seeds in there, and they grew wild strawberry plants in there from seed I gave them. And understand they were able to grow them big enough so they're able to sell them with their vegetable starts that spring, and that the plant sold really well. Okay, so here's the common violet, the dooryard violet, Viola soloria. So there are many different species of violets. Some are rare, you wouldn't want to pick them, and some have a laxative effect, so you might want to avoid that. But this is the common one that you see growing in people's lawns. And this is a photo I took in my lawn. You see how profuse they are. And violet leaves are edible, raw or cooked. Violet flowers are edible. And they're very pretty, obviously. You can use them to decorate other foods. You can candy them and use that to decorate other foods that you're making. And so I have just accidentally grown violets from seed in my nursery, but another way to get them is to just dig them up, because these plants can grow very profusely. So here's another photo from my lawn. So I was able to dig up all these plants, pop them up, and you cannot tell in my lawn that I pulled all these plants out. And then I would just offer these to other people to get them established on their properties. And some of the folks that were most interested in these plants were folks growing for pollinators, because I understand that these flowers are a good early season food source for the wild bumblebees. So they were happy to have them. I was happy to give them the plants. Okay, so here now we're going to shift to the rubus genus, which has raspberries and blackberries and dewberries and so on. So this is the showiest member of the genus, the flowering raspberry. These flowers are 2 inches across, which is very showy for a rubus species, and they're the beautiful magenta color. And these gorgeous leaves, these are huge leaves, about 8 inches across, and they're shaped like maple, and so that's fun to look at. And these plants don't have any thorns. So this is a plant that I think a homeowner might be very interested in planting in their yard, even if they never ate it, just to look at it. And the major part that's edible on these plants are these ripe fruits. And I'll have to admit that a regular red raspberry is probably a tastier fruit just because it's juicier. These fruit tend to be on the dry side, but the flavor is still perfectly nice. So they're perfectly edible raw or prepared into different things. Okay, so here's a fun seed collection story. So going back to cross-country skiing, which some of you heard I did earlier today. So up in New Hampshire, where I skied today, at a different spot in New Hampshire several years ago, I was skiing along and I saw the mummified remains of what I recognized as flowering raspberry berries growing along a brook at 10 degrees in the middle of the winter. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going to collect these seeds and see if I could grow plants in them in my nursery. And I have. I've got a bunch of flowering raspberry plants in my nursery that I grew from seed I gathered while I was cross-country skiing. So that was fun. So here's a cousin. This is black raspberry, another native species. And I don't need to tell you what to do with the fruit. I'm sure you can figure that out. The fun thing that black raspberry plants do in the dormant season is their canes turn this wonderful purple color, which is a color that you can see at quite a distance. So you could be 50 more yards away from these plants out in the winter, cross-country skiing, walking your dog, whatever, and you look over and you see these purple thorny plants. Those are black raspberries. And once again, here's your time when nature is producing a time when these plants really stand out in the landscape. Remember where that spot is and then go back and get them when the fruit is ripe. So depending upon where you're calling in from, that will be in mid to late spring or early summer. In the Boston area, it's like the end of June, beginning of July. Okay, so here's black huckleberries, which I'm sure a lot of people think are blueberries and pick them assuming they're blueberries. They're actually related to blueberries. And so there's absolutely no harm done in picking these. So these also have the preference for acidic soil. And it seems that black huckleberries can tolerate a little bit drier soil than the low bush regular blueberries do. And one way to tell these apart when the leaves are out in the summer is if you take one of these black huckleberry leaves and you flip it upside down in the sun, it will sparkle with little oily dots. And low bush blueberry leaves don't do that. So that's one way to tell the plants apart. And then here's a blue huckleberry, otherwise known as dangleberry. And this one likes swampier habitat than the blue huckleberry, the black huckleberry. But you know, it can be abundant fruit producer, like you're seeing in this photo here. And this is a fun foraging opportunity. And these plants produce fruit later than most of their blueberry cousins. So I've seen ripe fruit in this plant in the Boston area as late as Labor Day, when just about every other blueberry type plant is gone. So that might be a reason to plant them. And then May apples. So this is a plant that You don't find the natural patches in New England, although people plant it here, and it does find, especially with the increasingly warming climate, you get it to grow up here. So this is a plant that has an edible part. The key is this fruit has to be fully ripe for it to be safe to eat. And by the way, if you picked it and tried to eat it when it was unripe, it would taste horrible. So you know one bite, oh, I don't want to be eating this. So when they're fully ripe, they have a very tropical flavor like a guava. And who benefits from these in the natural environment? Box turtles love to eat these fruits. So you might bear them in mind and keep some fruit out there so they get what they need. But in the meantime, you can harvest them too. And if you find a lot of them, you can make stuff from them like sorbet and chiffon pie and stuff like that. Okay, so here is the common elderberry, and this plant is foraged for the flowers and for the berries. And some people will gather these flowers to make a drink from them. There's an alcoholic version, there's a non-alcoholic version. I tend not to eat the flowers off the plant because I am trying to keep the flowers on it, because if you pick the flowers, you're not going to get any fruit there. So I tend to just leave the plant and wait on the fruit. So I'm going to skip the next slide, which goes in more detail in the sake of saving time, and just talk about the fruit. So pardon me, I skip that. Okay, so here is the ripe fruit, and this photo is not upside down. That's what the berry clusters tend to do for the weight of the fruit, is hang upside down. And I understand that you can get a stomachache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you dry them first or cook them first, then it's safe to eat all you want. And I like to mix elderberries and apples together. So elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie is more interesting than just plain applesauce or apple pie. Okay, and I have grown elderberry from seed, although this is one of the plants that I understand you could just take a elderberry twig and jam it in the ground and it will sprout roots and grow that way. But I tend to grow things from seed to preserve the genetic diversity in the plants, just to make the landscape more resilient where I'm planting that. So that's true for almost all the plants in my nursery, for seed-grown plants, for that reason. Yes, so when you're growing plants, sometimes they'll begin to get pot bound, and you could tease these out and give them all an individual pot to grow in, or you could just put them in a bigger pot, like what I did here. So you can just stall for time just from moving from a smaller pot to a bigger pot. And so now these plants are big enough in my nursery, I'm planting them out on the sites I'm working on. So here's one of our native mints called wild bergamot. I do not know why it's called wild bergamot, because the flavor oil bergamot that we're most frequently exposed to, that's the flavoring ingredient in Earl Grey tea. Bergamot is actually a citrus fruit, and I don't see any resemblance between the flavor of this plant and the bergamot that's used in Earl Grey tea. So I don't have an explanation for that. So this plant, when you grab a leaf and scrunch it up, it has a savory smell and flavor. It smells and tastes like oregano. So that's how I suggest you use it for soups, omelets, casseroles, pizza topping, sausage baking, stuff like that. And this is a plant that I also get a lot of interest in from the plant for pollinators people, because apparently these flowers have a structure where you have to have a long tongue and be like a wild bumblebee to access the goodies in these flowers. So the plant for pollinators people are very eager to plant this out. And this is a good plant for, our native mints are not quite as aggressive as the spearmints and peppermints in our garden, but they will spread vegetatively. And so this is a species for considering planting in a spot where you might have a meadow that you've got some plants that you're not too keen on, and you wouldn't mind if the natives kind of, elbowed them out of the way a little bit. The wild bergamot can do that for you. And there is a red-flowered cousin called bee balm, that's Monarda didyma, that actually is not native to New England. It's native to Western New York State. But people are planting that around here, and that's fine if they choose to go that way. I just tend to promote the one that is known to be native to New England. So here's another member of the mint family, and this one is a sweet member. So this is much more like peppermint. So this is broadleaf mountain mint, Pycnanthemum muticum. It's a very sharp pepperminty flavor, so this would be a great plant for making mint tea from. And so another reason why people might want to plant this is, a lot of people have bird feeders because it's fun to be able to see the birds come in and get a good look at them. Well, this plant can do the same thing for pollinators and other insects. So if you're interested in observing pollinators, you can plant the broadleaf mountain mint on your property or someplace where it's convenient for you to keep an eye on it. And I have seen more in quantity and greater diversity of pollinators and other insects be attracted to these flowers than anything else I'm growing in my nursery. They're a real magnet for bugs, including this guy, the great blue wasp, which is a very big insect and looks quite scary, but it's, I understand they're relatively harmless. It's not interested in stinging you. It's just attracted to these flowers like so many other bugs are. Okay, so bayberry is a plant that is great for consideration if you've got poor soil, because this plant can make its own nitrogen fixing ability because it's got the symbiotic bacteria attached to nodules on its root systems. This plant comes in male and female, so if you want to plant with berries, you've got to plant a female plant. And then here's a close cousin called sweet fern. Oh, I forgot to say how bayberries are used. So you can use bayberry leaves like bay leaves of cooking. And sweet fern is one of our native species American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. And you just steep the leaves in hot water for a few minutes and you get a nice, strong flavored beverage. And the seeds inside the little burrs are edible. This is a plant that is challenging to grow from seed. I'm trying to do it, but this plant also suckers and produces clones. And so if you root prune it and let the plants develop their own personalized root system and then dig them up to move them, if you've got a great patch of them, that is one way to get some sweet ferns to deploy on other sites. Okay, so here's spicebush. This is another one of our native species the colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. They would just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes. And now my favorite part to gather in this plant are the berries. And I will dry them and then use them as a savory spice like Szechuan pepper or black pepper. So when you dry the berries, they lose that beautiful red color and they get this wrinkled color. And they, reddish brown, and then they're wrinkly on the outside. But once the berries are thoroughly dried, you can store them in a little jar and put them in your pantry, and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then when you want to use them, you just grind up a few in a little mortar and pestle and add them to food to get a savory flavor. So like the bayberry, spicebush is dioecious. It comes in male and female plants. If you want a plant that produces berries, you need to plant a female plant. Okay, so going back to these berries, it turns out that these berries are high in lipids, so they have a lot of energy in them, and the songbirds know this, and so they seek out the spicebush berries to eat them, to fatten up, to fuel up for their southward migrations. And so if you're ever gathering spicebush berries from the wild, it's really important to leave lots of berries on the plants so the birds get all they need that way. And you can grow spicebush from seed. And here's the case where many of our native species have seeds that will lose their viability if you let them dry out. So if you want to do this with spicebush, do not let the seeds dry out. So don't do what I do up here to make them edible. All the seeds inside these fruits are dead. They won't grow plants. So you have to keep these moist so you can let the outer fruit part rot away, pull that up, and then store these in a plastic bag or sow them like this, and then you get plants from them. Okay, and so here's how I sow most of the flats in my nursery, and I've learned from painful experience to deploy this half-inch mesh metal hardware cloth over just about every flat of anything I sow, even if the seed is really teeny, in order to keep the ravenous rodents from digging up the plants. So even in a case like this, I saw these thriving little spicebush seedlings, and I thought, okay, it's probably safe to pull the protective cover off now. And I regret doing that because the next day I went out and all these plants were uprooted because the ravenous rodents had been in to dug up what remained of the spicebush berries, which were still in there. So I don't think they were maliciously trying to unearth my plants. I think they just wanted that seed. So learn from me and don't make that mistake. Oh, and another reason you might want to plant spicebush is it's the host plant for this really cool critter called the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So down here at the bottom of the slide, you'll see this little guy right here. So he's about a ½ an inch long. He looks just like bird poop. So that's an ingenious disguise. Birds don't eat that. And then when the caterpillars get to be about 1.5 inches long, they've got these fake eye patches at the top on their heads to realize they're down here. The caterpillars try to impersonate a snake. So that works. And even at the pupa stage here in the lower right, you can see that the pupa is trying to impersonate a leaf. And so that's an effective disguise. So isn't it amazing how this organism has developed all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? So that's a fun critter to look for when you get spicebush or sassafras plants in your yard. Okay, so here's the common wintergreen, a very common plant here in New England, especially under white pine trees where the pine needles aren't smothering it like broadleaf plants might do with the leaf litter. And so the whole plant has the wintergreen flavor. And these berries have the wintergreen flavor too. They're not really sugary, but they do have the wintergreen flavor. And you can make a tea from these leaves, a sun tea, where you pick the leaves and stick it out in the sun and let it slow brew in the sun for a couple of days. But I tend to make the same flavored tea from a completely unrelated plant or plants called black or yellow birch. And I just made this yesterday because I'm going to be meeting with a bunch of middle schoolers on Cape Cod on Thursday. And I said to the instructor, why don't I bring them some birch twig tea? And he said, great idea. So any day of the year. So this photo was taken in the spring, but you can gather these twigs any day of the year and just peel them and put the peeled twigs in peelings in a glass jar and let it sit around for an hour. And you get a beverage which tastes like a wintergreen flavored lifesaver. So why do you have to peel them? It's because the oil of wintergreen is in the inner bark of these twigs. So it isn't until you peel them and expose that flavor that you're going to get it to go into the water. And yes, I don't have time to talk about it today, but you can tap birch trees for sap, just like maple trees. And around here, birches start flowing a couple weeks after the maples stop flowing. So if you're already tapping maples, you can just move your metal spiles from the maple trees to the birch trees and then tap them too. And it's really fun to grow birch trees from seed. And the time to gather the birch seed can be in the winter while you're out cross-country skiing. Is you can look for where the seed has just settled from the strobiles that will continue to shed in the winter, just right on the surface of the snow. You can just pick these off the surface of the snow, and then you want to sow the seed on the surface of the ground because the seeds actually need light to germinate. And then I have birch trees in my nursery. I do exactly this way from seed that I was gathering while I was cross-country skiing. So I'm happy to tell you there's no poisonous species of viburnums. So all the fruits in viburnums, none of it is poisonous. It doesn't mean they all taste good, like arrowwood, viburnum dentatum fruit doesn't taste good. Maple leaf viburnum fruit doesn't taste good, but there are several that do, including nannyberry is one of the fruits that tastes good. The texture of the fruit, it's kind of like a stewed prune. Not quite as sweet as a prune, but it has a slight sweetness to it. And so that's a fun thing to nibble on. And then wild raisins, same deal. These are a little smaller, but that's a fun thing to nibble on. The fruits ripe in September. And then hobblebush might be my favorite member of this genus. I saw a bunch of these today when I was cross-country skiing up in New Hampshire. And so in the spring, they've got this gorgeous early blossoming opportunity, which is great. And then in the fall, the berries start green and then they turn red. And when they're fully ripe, the ones you see in my hand here, they're black. And they have that similar flavor and texture like a stewed prune. And another great reason for planting hobblebush is they put on a spectacular fall foliage show. Now, sometimes I ask, and some of you might have this question that you're planning to ask in the Q&A, but I will just tell you right now, and the question might be, Russ, you've been doing this a while. Are you noticing any differences caused by climate change with the plants that you're working with? And the answer is yes, although, I'm not being very scientific about it. I just anecdotally notice some things. Like, for example, some of the fruits that I'm gathering. Like I used to tell for elderberry fruits in the Boston area, you want to pick them the first week of September. And now I'm saying it's more like the last week of August. So I'm seeing some of the ripening times creep earlier. And this plant, hobblebush, where I tend to run into it is I run into it on the cool, north-facing, shady slopes in our woods. And it is possible that as our climate continues to warm in southern New England, that we might begin to see some of our hobblebush populations begin to wink out in places like that where the climate just gets too hot and intolerable for these species. I don't think it threatens the species because, this very abundant plant where I was skiing today and in northern New England, I think it'd be okay for the foreseeable future, but it is a plant I'm concerned about in terms of its range, where it's going now. Okay, now I hope you all know this is not poison sumac. I have people that I teach on my walks that see the sumac and they start quaking their boots because they assume they've only heard of poison sumac and this must be the poison sumac. Well, when the plant has berries, it's exceedingly easy to tell this plant is not poison sumac because that's what poison sumac berries look like. Very similar to poison ivy berries, white, in these very loose, drooping clusters. So any sumac with these upright clusters of red berries is not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. So the three species that we tend to have here in New England is staghorn sumac. This is probably the most common one, where the twigs are furry like young deer antler velvet. But we also have smooth sumac and winged sumac, and they all have these upright, tight clusters of red berries. So, and these berries are edible. It's actually not the berries themselves, it's a drink that you make from the berries. So I'm going to tell you how to do that in just a second. So yeah, so this would be in midsummer. So ordinarily, these fruit ripen in midsummer and they'll be ripe into the fall, sometimes as late as Thanksgiving. But as you may know, if you're in New England, last summer was really, really wet. And so all that rain washed out the flavor on the berry cluster. So if you didn't gather them in midsummer, you're a little bit out of luck later on in the season. So you gather these, you put them in a boil of water, you rub them in the water, and the water turns this pinkish orange color. And then you take the berries and get rid of them. You're done with them. You take this liquid and you pour it through any kind of a filter, like this this paper towel. And then that will hold back any stray berries, anything else that's in the liquid. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. And I typically drink it cold and sweetened, like pink lemonade. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. Okay, and that's what the drink looks like. Now, all this text in the left is just warning you not to put spent sumac berries in your compost unless you want to be picking up baby sumac plants for at least 10 years after you make that mistake. So I did that once. I put the staghorn sumac fruits in my compost, and then I used that compost in my raised beds. And 10 years later, I'm still picking out sumac berries out of my raised beds. Now, for me, it's not a big deal because I'll just take those little sumac babies and pop them up and move them to my nursery, but you might get tired of doing that. Okay, and sumac is another underappreciated fall foliage plant. I'm going to just give a quick check of the time here. Okay, I'm doing good. In about 15 minutes, leave 15 minutes for questions. Okay, once again, phenology. I told you, sometimes the best time to spot a plant is not when the right part is out, but some other time. And this is absolutely true for this species. In fact, when I give talks on Cape Cod, where this plant is abundant, and I say to people, what is this plant? It is amazing how many audiences have no clue what it is. And then I give them a big hint. I say, look, here is a boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? And usually somebody in the audience say, oh, I think I know what that is now. Beach plum. Yes, so the best time to find beach plums is in the spring when the plants are blooming, because when the fruit is ripe, it's this purple color. And purple is a hard color to see at a distance. So it's better that you already know where the beach plums are in order to know where to go to gather the fruit. And in the southern Massachusetts, the best time to look for the fruit is Labor Day weekend. That's reliably good time. Sometimes they ripen earlier, sometimes they ripen later, but Labor Day weekend, I can pretty much assure you're going to find them. And for those of you that don't live right along the coast, don't worry, beach plums will grow other places. They happily grow far from the ocean, including all these that I picked from wild beach plums far from the ocean in Massachusetts. So I pick beach plums every year. I make the beach plum jam, which is good in and of itself, and then you can use that for raw material, like making these delicious magaluk. And there is an orange fruited beach plum, which is actually technically a subspecies of the purple ones. And so I save the pits from these, and I'm trying to grow some orange fruited beach plums in my nursery too. So every beach plum I gather from the wild, I save the pit and I grow a plant from it in my nursery. And I store the pits in a little plastic bag in my fridge. And this is another species where the pits start sprouting in my little bags in the dark in the stratification fridge, because the little timers have gone off. And when that happens, I have to sow the plants. And so I sow them indoors and then move them outside once they're big enough. And I have many dozens of beach plums growing in my nursery. I grew exactly the way I just described. Okay, so here's a fox grape, which some people might say, I'm not going to plant a grape in my yard because they're so rambunctious and they're going to clamber over everything else, and I'm not going to like that, which is fine. But this is a wonderfully delicious plant. And the way you often encounter it in the wild is you smell it before you see it when the ripe fruit is on there, and you follow your nose to the vine and stuff your face right by the vine. And so it's very easy to pick baskets of fruit like this. And so the fox grape cheesecake is a great way to use the fruit. And here's a relative called the riverside grape. And this one, these grapes are edible, but they're not as yummy raw as the fox grape. But you could still make grape jam or grape jelly from them. But some people say this is the best species for making the stuffed grape leaves, which you can do in June. So not when the berries are ripe. It's too late to harvest the leaves then. In the spring, when the leaves are tender and the riverside grape leaves are smooth and green on the underside. And yes, you can make your own wild stuffed grape leaves from wild grape leaves. And you can use any species of leaf to do this, but it's just the herbicide grape leaf works really well. So we've got two native species of hazelnuts in New England, the common hazelnut and the beaked hazelnut. And the only difference is the appearance of the husk surrounding the nut. And so these have already bloomed in my nursery like 3 weeks ahead of schedule because we had the extra warm early, late winter, very early spring. Now it's gotten cold again here, but it's going to warm up again. And I've been told that the hazelnuts can handle that oddity in the weather, but I do worry about other things in the weirdness weather that we're having now. So these you want to gather when the hazelnuts are still attached to the plant. Do not wait till these nuts fall on the ground because you'll never get them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get them before you do. And so there's the beaked hazelnut with the strange thing sticking out here. So once again, to eat the nuts, you want to let them dry out. To grow plants and nuts, do not let them dry out because they'll lose their viability if you do it that way. So I store any hazelnuts I get in a plastic bag in the fridge so I'm ready to sow them. And where I tend to gather them, where I have the best luck gathering hazelnuts in the wild, is underneath power lines. And I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation they're getting. I think it's just all the sun they get there. And plus, for a squirrel or a chipmunk, my main competition, that's a scary place for them to be because there's hawks and foxes and snakes and other things that will see them and eat them in a spot like this. So they can't be working the bushes as heavily. So I get lots of hazelnuts there, which, as I say, mostly I'm using them to propagate into trees now in my nursery. So all oak trees produce acorns if it's a mast here, and all acorns are edible. The question is, how much tannic acid is in the acorn in terms of palatability? And ideally, you want to start with an acorn that's relatively low in tannic acid, and those tend to be the acorns with the rounded lobes like these white oak acorns. Tricky thing about propagating white oak is they start to sprout just about as soon as the acorns hit the ground. And so you need to sow them right away. You cannot store these seeds. I made an attempt to do that, and all these seeds sprouted and rotted while I had them stored. So sow them right away after you gather them. Shagbark hickory, my #1 favorite edible species out of everything that's edible out there. I love gathering this one and using it. And, you know, this bark isn't a seasonal phenomenon. The bark always looks like that. So this is a tree to keep your eyes peeled for year-round. So here's where the name comes from. Pauca hickory is the indigenous preparation they'd use. It's a porridge, which is really delicious and worth making. So I'll gather many baskets of these nuts when they're ripe in late September, early October. And when you break the nuts open, that's what they look like inside. There's the penny for scale. And here's a recipe for my book, Maple Hickory Nut Pie, which is a New England version of pecan pie. It's really yummy. And here's several cookies I'm making from shagbark hickory nuts. So whether this would be a live program, I would have made a batch of these for you and served them to you. So I apologize, I can't do that through the internet. So I propagate shagbark hickory trees from seed. You see that I'm using the hardware cloth to prevent the seedling hickories by being unearthed by the ravenous rodents. And what I say to myself when I do this is I say, if they only knew what I was doing, all these nut trees that I'm growing, and how their progeny would really benefit from having all these additional nut trees in the landscape producing nuts that their progeny could eat. But no, the squirrels and chipmunks are thinking short term, and we humans, we can relate to that because we often think the same way. Okay, so black walnuts, you do not have to pick these off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then they pile up in the ground like gold green tennis balls. To eat these, you do want to let them dry out, and then you crack them open. This is the device I use to get them open and to get big pieces out that way. And here's 2 different preparations I make. These recipes are on my webpage. So this is one I've made for the middle school I'm meeting with later this week, the black walnut honey squares. Here's a bunch of other trees that produce edible fruits and nuts. These are all native that I don't have time to get into. Sorry about that, except for tupelo. So tupelo berries are very sour, but they make an excellent jam or jelly. And it's a gorgeous plant to add to your landscape because it has this gorgeous fall foliage color. And by the way, you might think, well, I don't live in a swamp. How can I plant tupelo? In my town, Arlington, Massachusetts, this is one of the species that our town offers as a street tree. So it has demonstrated ability to thrive even with a hell strip. So, and there's the seed. I propagate plants from the seed, which is a lot of fun. There it is growing in my nursery. And here's groundnut, which has an edible part, the tubers. You can propagate it from the tubers or the seeds in there, and you can fry up and make groundnut chips from it. So it's a perennial herbaceous plant that indigenous people use a lot. Okay, so with that, let me just spend a few minutes telling you what I'm doing with all these plants I'm growing in my nursery. So as Catherine said at the intro, I set up this nursery outside of Boston where I'm propagating many hundreds of plants, most of which I grow from seed that I gather myself. And then I work out arrangements with cities and towns, state and federal agencies, schools and colleges, indigenous groups to plant plants from my nurseries in appropriate places in their properties. So here's the compilation I put together. So we're going to give you a link to this at the end of the talk. If you have any trouble finding it, let me know. It's a compilation I put together that includes most of the native species, the native to the Northeast, that are edible by people. So there's over 190 plants on this list. So you want to know what's edible, native is a good source. Here's my stratification fridge. It's a little bit more better organized than it was when I took this photo, but this is where I store my seed. And then I do most of my sowing outside, which I learned from the Wild Seed Project, because they said native plants like to be grown as close as possible to the conditions at which they grow in the wild, which is obviously outside. They're not pampered or coddled like our garden plants are. So you sow them outside. Now, ideally, this is what happens. You get a wonderful covering of snow that insulates your seed flats, keeps everything nicely hydrated. But with the increasingly weird weather we have, this is an increasingly rare occurrence now, which is sad. So for the seeds that are precocious, I start them indoors. There's some, so this couple views of what my nursery looks like. Here's my mom, which helped me grow a plant called wild lettuce, which is a yummy native species of lettuce. And this one is the yummy one that has these terminal lobes that are skinny like a finger, because this wild lettuce with these broad terminal lobes is bitter from the get-go. So you want to use the one with the skinny lobes like a finger. And it produces seed in September and little blow balls that look like dandelions, and you gather the seed and you grow the plants from the seed, which is a lot of fun. Which I've done. You do not need to read through this list. This is just a list of a few of the places I have done native plantings. Don't need to go through that. I'll just go through a few examples. We're almost done with the show. Here's an island off the shore, Marblehead, Mass. This is out in the Atlantic Ocean, a spot where I've led many wild edibles walks where I noticed there were no beach plums despite suitable habitat for beach plums. So I asked the land trust that managed this property, can we plant some beach plums here? And they said yes. So I found some places to plant the beach plums. I dug the holes. We organized some volunteers. We brought the plants over across the mud plant at low tide to bring the plants out. We put them in the holes I dug, and there are the plants. So not be misleading if I told you every single plant we put in is thriving. I made a few rookie mistakes. I planted some too close to the oak, and they just got inundated with salt water, and they didn't like that. But at least 6 of the plants are thriving. Here's another island not nearby called Baker's Island, Salem, where I lead an annual wild edibles walk every year. And I supplemented with additional native species plants that, in addition to the plants that are already out there in the island. So here is Riverwalk. This is in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where they've done a beautiful job at turning neglected eyesore of a riverbank into a native showpiece. And so I've done plantings here and lead walks there. Here's 2 of the plants I put in at Riverwalk, sassafras and hobblebush. And these are native to Berkshire County, and you can see they're both thriving in the locations where I put them in. And this is very gratifying to see in the work I do when I look at a spot in the landscape and say to myself, you know, I have seen, you know, X-plant like to grow in that spot, and I drop X-plant in there. And when X-plant thrives, and I see it, I feel like this plant is trying to send me a message. And the message is, Russ, thank you so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. And it's a great message to get. So here's a municipal project, the town of Lexington, Mass, where they had a pipe, a stream flowing through a pipe, and the pipe collapsed. And so instead of replacing the pipe, they daylighted it and they put it in a natural stream. And so I brought some plants from my nursery, and the town procured some plants from their survivor and supplier. And we put these plants in, and so here's a flowering raspberry plant that I put in, and it's also thriving. Once again, very happy in the spot I picked for it. Here's a site, an Audubon Society property in along the east shore of Narragansett Bay, where we put in some beach plums where they weren't growing. Here's the shagbark hickory, and you see, once again, we're deploying the hardware cloth to keep the deer from eating these plants. Now, at some point, they'll get tall enough they're going to withstand the herbivory, but not when they're young. So this is a good idea to protect your plants when you put them out there if you got deer pressure. So here's the Audubon Society up in Maine where I've done some planting. And one of the plants I put in was spikenard, and it's really happy there in the stream that we planted it. And this plant has berries that are edible and medicinal, and they have a very aromatic flavor, and they're the same color. And I think, to my mind, they have a flavor that's vaguely like cola, like Coca-Cola. Okay, here's one of my more recent projects. This is a Milwaukee Forest in Cambridge, Mass, on a former landfill where they took 1,000 square feet and they converted it from a lawn, the mowed lawn, into this very diverse, very densely planted patch. So here I am with my plants I brought from my nursery, putting some in. There's an aerial view of it. There was a really nice article in the New York Times about this project last fall and about Milwaukee Forest in general. So when I have extra seed, I'm happy to share it. So here is the South Shore chapter of a natural organization called Wild Ones. And here I am on their seed sharing day with a bunch of seeds from my nursery I'm happy to share. So for those of you that want to know about books that are good to look at on this topic, there's this one, Native Plant Agriculture, that I recommend, especially if you want to know, okay, so everything in this book is edible by people, but I want to know what other critters, like what other birds, really benefit by me planting this plant in the landscape. This book is particularly good on that. And then here's a book that came out more recently that was written by Jared Rosenbaum, who runs a native plant nursery in the Delaware Water Gap in New Jersey. And it is a great book. So I'm doing what I'm doing just because it's in gratitude to thank Mother Nature for all the plants that I've been nibbling on all these years. My way to get back is to add more native edible plants to the landscape. And Jared makes, I think, a very well-reasoned argument why everybody should be doing this, even if you're not actively foraging like I am, just to have these plants out in the environment. It's a good idea to reconnect people to land, and that's a great way to do it. Okay, so I have persuaded the ELA staff to put this information in a follow-up message to you, so you'll be able to click on those links and you don't have to figure out how to do it from a PowerPoint. So these links will be available, especially the one at the top. There's lots and lots of good information there that for those of you that are stimulated enough to hear this talk to say, well, how would I actually do that? All these links will give you that great information. With that, I'm done finally. And here's this book that I wrote that I mentioned a couple times in my talk. We're about to have this book printed for the 9th time. And we're finally going to put a land acknowledgement in it. And also, I'm going to put a strong statement in there to thank Native people for all the wonderful things I've learned from them in the wild edibles that I've been collecting and enjoying all these years. So with that, thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Russ, thank you so much for that excellent and informing presentation. To all of our attendees, you will notice that the evaluation link has been placed into the chat. Please make sure that you click on that link and fill it out. It should take you less than 2 minutes, and it helps us to improve your webinar experience going forward. Speaking of educational and engaging, we got a fantastic number of questions in the chat. One of those askers actually already has their hand raised. So rather than reading their questions from the chat, username AL, I invite you to come off of mute and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, I was just curious if you could reiterate the piece around very earlier in the presentation, you said, you know, there's some debate and discussion about how far from.
Yes. Yeah, the local ecotype issue.
Yes.
So the folks that feel really strongly that you should only plant local ecotype plants are concerned about genetic contamination of existing native species in the area. That if you bring in a plant from Mississippi or Minnesota and you're planting it in New England, that the pollinators might not know and go back and forth with the pollen, and that your existing native populations will be quote unquote contaminated from the genes that come from the plants that are grown from away. And they feel like, oh, this is going to threaten the plants. And I've heard other people make the exact opposite argument, that they say that our native plants are threatened by a genetic bottleneck, and that their genetic variety is very low because they're not mixing from plants with others. And by bringing in other members of the same species from other, we're actually adding to the resiliency and diversity of these plants to cope with climate change. And so, you know, in this case, what I say to myself is I think that I honor both opinions, and I just made the statement that, you know, if you are able to get a locally grown plant from local seed, that I think an argument is fair to be made that the chances of that plant surviving in your local yard is greater than a plant that's shipped in from very far away.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Did you also want to ask your question about the roots of the marsh marigold, AL?
Yeah, yes. Do marsh marigold require year-round wet roots?
They like to grow in very swampy areas. So where I typically see them as growing in the muck along a perennially flowing stream. And so they're not a plant, for example, that would do well in a rain garden that's wet only when it rains and then they dry out. So no, so basically my advice to you, if you live in a place where marsh marigolds grow, is go there and look at the conditions under which they're existing in the wild. And then when you're roaming around thinking, well, where could I plant marsh marigolds? Try and find a spot as close in similarity to that, to the, the plant community and the other plants like to grow, to the hydrology and stuff like that. And that will enhance the chances that, and that's what I've done. So the places where I planted marsh marigolds that are thriving, I just, extrapolated from places where I'd seen them grow in other places and said, okay, well, this looks like where I've seen them growing. I'm going to try it here, and they have done well.
Thank you. Yeah, I have an intermittent stream situation, and I'm realizing, like, yeah, I really don't think I've seen marsh marigold in intermittent stream. So, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Our next question is, why the multiple water changes recommendation for marsh marigold? Is it a diuretic?
Yes. No. There's a toxicity in the plant. You absolutely can't eat it raw. So it's got a chemical that, it's not one of these deadly poisonous plants, but I still wouldn't want people to get sick from anything they ate. Yes, so the changes of water are to make sure that you fully dissipated this toxic principle that's in the raw plant. And now the marsh marigold leaves have a lot of substance to them. So even though they taste like spinach, the leaves are much more substantial than spinach. So even after a couple changes of water, it's not just going to be a limp mess. The leaves hold up pretty well, even to all that boiling and changing the water. So that's just, once again, I'm not, I'll be honest with you, I'm not doing a lot of collecting the marsh marigold leaves to eat these days. It just has an important historical role, and it's also a plant that's fun to propagate from seeds. So that's why I kept it in this show.
Great. We do have another question, but this one is more of a comment and a combined comment at that. From some people outside your area. We do have a reminder that not every park encourages foraging, as well as it's important to watch out for toxins in soil in industrial areas such as New York City.
Right. Those are both true. And so, so this isn't the subject in this talk, but when I'm teaching people about edible wild plants, I'm pointing out the weeds and invasive species, the more guilt-free foraging opportunities, the really abundant, ubiquitous plants that are in the landscape. And there you can forage in a much more relaxed way. And yes, I absolutely encourage folks who are going to go foraging is to check in with the landowner, the land manager of any place you'd like to forage. And it's a great courtesy. People love the courtesy of being asked. And also the nice thing about it for you is you are able to track down a landowner or land manager, and they say yes, then you can forage in a really cheerful, carefree way. And you don't have to be looking over your shoulder thinking, is somebody going to get mad at me for what I'm doing here?
Great. Taylor Shaw asked if you have an online guide to starting seeds.
So I would go to the Wild Seed Project website, because that's where it's very, very user-friendly. So there is some of the links that I showed you at the end of my show will have some information like that, but the really user-friendly, here's how to do it, recipe for how to grow native plants from seed, I encourage you to go to the Wild Seed Project. Even if you're not from Maine or New England, you'll still find it very user-friendly.
I love that that is what you said, because the comment directly underneath that question from Jennifer Palmer is a link to Wild Seed Project.
Excellent.
And then, as I stated earlier in the chat, early on in the presentation, Russ will be sharing his slides with ELA staff so that we can distribute those to all of you so that you can explore the links and read back over them. Susan Socks asks, I've had a hard time keeping young spice bush plants alive. Any propagation tips?
Oh, I have not run into that problem. So the Heather McCarver, the woman that started the Wild Seed Project, she says something that I use as a kind of a mantra as my guidance, and that is, think of how it happens in nature and just try to approximate that when you can. So think about the kind of growing conditions where you see spice bush growing in its natural habitat where I see it in New England. is growing as an understory plant in the shade in the place near where there's a perennial intermittent stream. So pretty similar to what marsh marigold likes. And so if you're able to find a spot like that to grow the plants and to keep them going, or try to approximate those conditions in your nursery, I think your chances of having the spice bush plants do better should be greater. But I think they're pretty tough plants. And one of the nice things about spice bush is because it's such a strongly flavored plant that deer tend not to like it. So it's a plant that folks that have heavy deer pressure, they can try it and maybe have less of an issue from that on that species.
Thank you, Russ. This next question from Kate, forgive me if I'm saying this wrong, Crucy. It's a two-parter. So it says, is it difficult to pull the hardware cloth off over the small woody seedlings, and do you lose buds in the process?
Right. So the answer is it's surprisingly not hard for most plants to pull that hardware cloth off. Like for hazelnut, I just did it the other day, and I had, out of a flat of maybe 20 plants growing in it, and I pulled the hardware cloth off. I think I lost one portion of one plant in pulling it off. But for things that, depending upon the timing, how big the plant has gotten, if it's big and you start lifting the hardware cloth off and the plant is saying, I don't like this, then you get your tin snips out and you just cut enough of the hardware cloth away so you can make the hole bigger so that you can successfully pull the plant through the hole.
Great. This next one is a comment, and I'm going to read the comment and then go straight into the next question, just because you deserve to hear all of your praise. This person said, Russ, thank you. This is an awesome presentation packed with wonderful, inspiring information. And then the next question is, Russ, I am dying to know what your nursery is called. Is it Russell's Garden Center? Would love to support it.
Yeah, so there is a Russell's Garden Center. That's a commercial nursery operation. It's actually pretty good. They do carry a fair number of native plants. It's actually down the road from my nursery. So my nursery doesn't have a name because it's not a business. I give away all the plants I grow there. And just in case you're curious, mostly my intention for these plants is to have them planted in public places where the public can see and interact with them. So it's not really for somebody's yard, although occasionally I have, had plants go off to people's yards. And certainly if somebody wanted to help me out of my nursery and pitch in and give me a little, help doing things, I'm happy to pay them in plants. And that would be one way to get them. And by the way, the nursery is located in Weston, Mass, which is outside Boston. And I'm happy to have people come and visit the nursery. I can show you around, and tell you a little bit about how I grow plants there.
Well, that answers the next question, which was about a nursery open to individuals.
And I forgot to answer, well, if my nursery had a name, and eventually I might actually name it this, I would call it Gratitude Nursery, because that's why I'm growing it, to express my gratitude to Mother Nature for all these wonderful things I've been connecting to her, the gifts that she's given me that I've been nibbled on all these years.
I love that very, very much. Gratitude is an important value, principle, philosophy that I live my life by. The last comment that we have right now is not a question so much, but just thanks for mentioning deer pressure. And that is from, I have no idea how to pronounce it. And with a name like mine, I hate mispronounced names. So
let me just respond to the comment and say, yes, for those in the know, they know that, people complain a lot about invasive species, but sometimes the presence of invasive species is a symptom of the bigger problem, which is the deer pressure. Like those of you in the Northeast know, you go into some woods and you see like all these Japanese barberry plants that are proliferating. And one of the reasons that happens is because the deer have eaten everything else and left the Japanese barberry behind. So is the barberry ecologically disruptive? Yes, but it's kind of showing you some other thing that's out of balance in addition to just the presence of the barberry.
All right, and it looks like that just about wraps the questions for the comment section. Again, folks, the SurveyMonkey link is in the chat. That information is useful to all of us at ELA. It will be passed on as needed to anybody who it can benefit. We've got another comment saying thank you from Taylor Shaw, and I believe that, that question and that answer Sanacor Jensen. There we go. Thanks for giving me the pronunciation. But gratitude is a great note to end this on, because I think I safely speak for everyone when I say we are very grateful to have had this time for you today. Russ, I would ask that you forward your best contact information over to us at ELA and Catherine.
Okay, yeah. When you send your follow-up email, it can absolutely be in there. Be happy to do it. Yeah.
Yes, we will make sure that your contact is sent out so that we can get as many people to the soon-to-be Gratitude Nursery as soon as possible. Russ, thank you so much for your time, for your presentation, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise. It has been a pleasure. And to everybody else, have a wonderful week, and thank you for joining us.
You're so welcome. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Good night. Bye, all.